Hello dolls, and welcome back to another video. This video has already consumed me all week long. I have been wanting to make another deep dive all about groupie culture because I've made a video on this several years ago, but it was quite short because at the time I just kind of started to learn about the topic, and I was really intrigued by what I found and also quite disturbed, if I'm being honest. But over the last years I've read so much more about groupies and the whole groupie culture and groupie phenomenon. And one thing that always stood out to me is how the 1970s ruined groupie culture forever. And that is what I want to talk about in this video. I've spent all week researching. That's also why there was no video on Wednesday. I got around to film it, but then I just did not have any time to edit it because there was so much research needed for this video. But I really hope it was all worth it. This is actually a little bit of a first for me. It is already almost midnight. I usually try to film at noons, but this week was chaotic and I just have a little bit of time on my hand right now. So I figured I would just sacrifice a little bit of sleep to bring you this video. Just before we get into this video, I will discuss sexual relationships between minors and adults, as well as imbalancements of power and abuse. So if that is something that you don't want to hear today, then please don't watch this video. I'm gonna link something here for you that is a little more upbeat and a little more fun. Please take care of yourself. But now, without any more talking, let's take a look at the shattered illusion of how the 1970s exposed the dark heart of a groupie culture. The shimmering, romanticized image of the groupie, a free-spirited muse, a backstage confidant, a symbol of rock and roll's untamed spirit, has long been a fixture in popular culture. Films like Almost Famous perpetuate this myth, painting a picture of ethereal women thrifting through a golden age of music, their lives a whirlwind of adventure, passion, and rebellion. These portrayals often emphasize the groupies' devotion to the music and the artists, portraying them as liberated women living on their own terms. However, beneath this glossy veneer lies a far more complex and often disturbing reality. While some women undoubtedly found genuine connection, creative inspiration, and a sense of agency within the rock and roll world, the darker undercurrents of groupie culture reveal a landscape riddled with power imbalances, coercion, and outright exploitation. This stark contrast between the fantasy and the reality reached its zenith in the 1970s, a decade that simultaneously elevated and ultimately dismantled the idealized image of the groupie. The 1970s, a period marked by both cultural liberation and rampant excess, became a crucible for the groupie phenomenon. The decade saw rock and roll reach unprecedented heights of popularity, transforming musicians into veritable gods. This elevation of rock stars created an environment ripe for abuse. The power dynamics were heavily skewed, with young, often impressionable women drawn into the orbit of wealthy, influential men. The promise of backstage access, fleeting moments of intimacy, and the vicarious thrill of being close to fame proved intoxicating, blurring the lines between consent and coercion. The 1960s, often viewed through a nostalgic lens of carefree experiences for groupies, gave way to a darker reality in the 1970s. The emergence of baby groupies, alarmingly young girls as young as 12 or 13, revealed a deeply disturbing trend. These underage girls were transformed into objects of desire, exposing the predatory underbelly of the music industry. Vulnerable and easily manipulated, they were groomed and exploited, shattering the myth of the groupie as a symbol of female liberation. Furthermore, the 1970s unveiled a pervasive objectification of women, where they were treated as disposable commodities. The idealized image of the groupie as a muse vanished, replaced by fleeting transactional encounters fueled by commercialization and the insatiable demand for access to rock stars. Ultimately, the 1970s served as a pivotal moment, forever altering the perception of groupie culture. The decade's excess, the exposure of underage exploitation, and the systematic objectification of women destroyed the illusion of the free-spirited muse. While the romanticized image may linger in popular culture, the stark realities of power imbalances, coercion, and unchecked exploitation were undeniable. The decade's legacy demands a critical examination of the complex and troubling dynamics within the rock and roll scene and the entertainment industry as a whole. Chapter 1: The Origins of Groupie Culture. The term groupie originated around 1965 to describe teenage girls or young women who followed bands and musicians regularly, though the phenomenon itself had existed long before. Mary McCarthy, who is currently on my personal reading list with her novel The Group, had described this phenomenon in her 1942 novel The Company She Keeps. Some sources credit the Rolling Stones bassist Bill Wyman with coining the term during their 1965 Australian tour, though he himself refuted this, stating that he and his bandmates used other code words for women on tour. But it was the Rolling Stones magazine that brought groupies into the mainstream with their February 1969 issue titled Groupies the Girls of Rock, emphasizing their role in the rock scene, while Time magazine followed with their own article later that month. In this article, musicians like Jimmy Page categorized women who associated with them into two groups. There were the groupies and the so-called starfuckers. He described groupies as friends and sexually experienced partners, while starfuckers were seen as solely focused on sleeping with celebrities. The article presented groupies as a social group, committed to their lifestyle and valuing both friendship and sexual connection with musicians. The early groupie culture of the 1960s was deeply intertwined with the counterculture movement, free love, and the psychedelic scene. Women like Pamela Des Barres, Cleo Odzer, and Barbara Cope, also known as the Butter Queen, became known not just for their relationships with rock stars, but also for their influence on music and fashion. Cynthia Plaster Caster, famous for her plaster casts of rock and roll musicians' genitalia, and the legendary GTOs blurred the lines between fleeting sexual encounters and true groupies, who traveled with musicians, acting as sort of road wives for them and managing aspects of their lives. Connie Hamzy, known as Sweet Sweet Connie, openly embraced the groupie lifestyle, stating, quote, "Look, we're not hookers, we love the glamour." For these women, the experience of being a groupie was far different from what it would become for the women following them. So let's talk about some of the most famous 1960s groupies, starting with Miss P, who lived on the edge of 1960s and 70s groupie culture. Pamela Des Barres, who was born as Pamela Miller, remains one of the most legendary groupies of the 1960s, with romantic ties to rock icons like Jimmy Page, Mick Jagger, and Jim Morrison. Known as Miss Pamela or simply Miss P, she traveled extensively with Led Zeppelin and took on a nurturing role, even sewing clothes for the man she adored. But Pamela was more than just a muse. She was a musician herself, joining a little group known as Girls Together Outrageously, or short, the GTOs. The GTOs were an eccentric, avant-garde, all-female groupie collective turned performance act formed in 1968 under the guidance of Frank Zappa, consisting of Miss Pamela, Miss Mercy, Miss Christine, Miss Cinderella, Miss Lucy, Miss Sandra, and Miss Sparky. They were more than just admirers of rock stars. They were artists in their own right, blending spoken word, theatrical performances, and offbeat harmonies with their outlandish stage personas. Their only album, Permanent Damage, released in 1969, featured contributions from rock luminaries like Jeff Beck and Rod Stewart. But it was more of a cult oddity than a commercial success. After the group disbanded just a year later in 1970, the members followed different paths. Miss Christine became a nanny for Alice Cooper before her untimely death in 1972. Miss Mercy continued her involvement in the music scene, and Miss Pamela went on to become the most famous of them all, chronicling her experiences in best-selling books. In many ways, the GTOs stood for the carefree groupie culture of the 1960s. They danced along their favorite acts, made music, and enjoyed life as young girls who adored music. Yes, they were sleeping with rock stars, but they were all of age, and according to Miss P's memoir, they had a lot of fun and a genuinely good time. After the group disbanded, Miss P continued her life and immersed herself in the rock world before eventually marrying musician and actor Michael Des Barres. Reflecting on her experiences, she wrote 2 books, I'm with the Band, Confessions of a Groupie, which she released in 1987, and Take Another Little Piece of My Heart, released in 1993, which chronicles not only just her relationships, but also the unique cultural role groupies played. I cannot recommend you these books enough. Miss P gives this really good insight into the 1970s rock and roll culture, groupies, and just what life was like for young women who adored music. She has a really good sense of writing, and her books come from her diaries, which she wrote in the 1960s and 70s. I read her books as I was getting into 1960s and 70s culture, and I truly adore the way that she writes and cherishes these times. She's also said to be one of the muses behind Penny Lane of Almost Famous. There is another one whom we're going to talk about in a little bit, but I just wanted to take a moment here to recommend you these fabulous books. A groupie is to a rock band what Maria Magdalene was to Jesus, she famously declared, positioning herself and her peers as caretakers and confidants rather than mere fans. Cleo Odzer was another one of the most famous 1960s groupies, gaining national attention after being featured in Newsweek's Super Groupies article. She was engaged to Keith Emerson of The Nice, but their relationship ended abruptly when he saw the article and broke off the engagement. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Cleo moved beyond the rock scene and reinvented herself as an author and anthropologist. Though she moved away from her groupie past, Cleo's life reflected a deep fascination with underground movements, making her one of the intellectually most curious figures to emerge from the groupie era. Barbara Cope was also known as the Butter Queen, and she truly deserves her place as one of the most legendary groupies of the late 1960s and early 1970s. She was celebrated by rock icons like Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, and the Rolling Stones. Her notoriety even made its way into the Rolling Stones song Rip This Joint. She was known for her intimate relationships with numerous musicians, including Mick Jagger, Joe Cocker, and David Cassidy. Cassidy recalled the awe she inspired among his band and crew who were, quote, shaking with anticipation at the news of her arrival. Beyond her infamous reputation, Barbara also developed genuine and deep connections with musicians, with Elton John once noting that they got on famously. Now, one might wonder how this girl earned the nickname of the Butter Queen, and the truth is that it came from her unconventional sexual practices involving butter, a detail David Cassidy humorously describes in his memoir. When asked about her past, Barbara remained mysterious, stating, quote, those who know, and those who don't wish they did. Cynthia Albritton, also known as Cynthia Plaster Caster, is often said to have been a 1960s groupie, which to some extent is true, but she definitely was an artist first. She embarked on a unique artistic endeavor in 1968, creating plaster molds of rock stars' penises. Inspired by a college art assignment to cast something solid that could retain its shape, she combined her love for rock music with her fascination for the musicians. Starting with an attempt to cast members of Paul Revere and the Raiders, she gained notoriety within the rock community. Jimi Hendrix became her first successful subject, initiating a trend that drew artists like Jello Biafra, Chris Kennelly, Wayne Kramer, and John Langford. Frank Zappa, recognizing the commercial potential, invited her to Los Angeles to exhibit her work, though the hope for a grand exhibition didn't materialize due to waning interest among musicians in the casting process. Cynthia captured rock history during a time when rock stars and their fans were closer than ever. I'm one of the hosts of a podcast all about the incredible women of the 1960s and 70s, and our season finale of last year's season was actually about Cynthia Plaster Caster, so I'm gonna link that in the description box in case anyone wants to know more about her. We talked about her for over an hour. My co-host Abby was able to get a couple of people on who knew her, and we had such a good time. So before we go on with this video, I quickly want to say that the tales and stories of these early groupies are mostly positive, and that is wonderful. And I feel like this is the time that kind of like brought this dream of the wonderful groupie, the muse, the girl who was traveling along with the band, who adored the music, who was just there as a friend, as a confidant, and yes, who had sex with the band, but that was not the major point of it. But yet, even in the beginning, there was one inherent issue between these relationships. Chapter 2, the issue of the power imbalance. An issue that started in the 1960s but got way worse and bigger in the 1970s. While the 1960s are often remembered for their utopian ideals of peace and love, the reality was that the music industry remained a man's world. Women were often treated as accessories to the rock stars they followed, but the notion of groupies as willing, empowered participants in the rock and roll lifestyle persisted. Many young women saw their relationships with musicians as romantic adventures, but the power dynamics were already problematic. Rock stars held all the control. They were wealthy, famous, and older, while their admirers were often young adults or even teenagers with little real-world experience. The music industry enabled this culture, where groupies were considered part of the package, one more indulgence alongside drugs and excess. Even in the 1960s, the idea that these relationships were entirely consensual is questionable, but by the 1970s, the situation took a far more disturbing turn. Chapter 3. The groupie scene in the 1970s, when things turned dark. Despite their influence, groupies were often dismissed or stigmatized, a trend that worsened in the 1970s. Feminist scholars like Norma Coates criticized the media for reducing these women to mere sexual objects, rather than acknowledging their role in shaping music culture. Rolling Stone's 1969 groupie feature, for example, included profiles of women who were actually musicians. Music critic Ralph J. Gleason observed that groupies set the standard for which bands were considered cool. Before the 1970s, groupie culture was more about admiration and access. Fans and musicians occupied the same spaces, and bands played in small venues where personal connections were easier to form. The power imbalance was present, but had not yet evolved into the industrialized exploitation that would come in the following decade. As rock music grew into a multi-million-dollar industry in the 1970s, the groupie scene lost much of its spontaneity and intimacy. What had once been a space for genuine connection and mutual admiration between musicians and their followers became an assembly line of fleeting encounters. The shift in power dynamics was stark. Musicians were no longer just talented artists scraping by, but untouchable figures with unparalleled influence. The buffet analogy used to describe the way women were treated backstage wasn't just a metaphor. It reflected the increasing dehumanization of groupies, who were often seen as disposable, their names and faces forgotten as soon as the night was over. Despite this, certain groupies became famous in their own right. Some, like Bebe Buell, saw themselves as muses and built their own careers alongside the musicians they admired. Bebe wasn't just a groupie. She was a model, a singer, and a true rock and roll muse. Discovered as a teenager, she quickly became one of the most recognizable faces in the fashion world, appearing in Playboy as Miss November in 1974. But it was her connection to the music industry that truly defined her legacy. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Bebe moved fluidly between the roles of lover, friend, and inspiration to some of rock's biggest names. Her relationships with musicians like Todd Rundgren, Mick Jagger, and Jimmy Page cemented her status as a fixture in the rock world, but it was her brief affair with Steven Tyler that led to the birth of her daughter, Liv Tyler. Bebe initially raised Liv with Todd Rundgren, who willingly took on the role of father, believing Steven Tyler was too unstable due to his rock star lifestyle. It wasn't until Liv was a teenager that she learned the truth, something Bebe later said she had done to protect her daughter. Despite her close ties to rock legends, Bebe was more than just a muse. She had her own musical ambitions. In the 1980s, she fronted the B-Sides and later the Gargoyles, determined to carve out her own place in the industry. Though often labeled a groupie, she rejected the term, arguing that she was more of an insider than a mere fan. Quote, "I wasn't a groupie," she once said. "I was a girlfriend. I was in love." And then there was Connie Hamzy, better known as Sweet Sweet Connie. Unlike many groupies who sought out long-term relationships with musicians, Connie took pride in her status as a backstage legend, famously saying, "I didn't want to marry rock stars, I wanted to be with them." Her name became so synonymous with the rock and roll lifestyle that Grand Funk Railroad even mentioned her in their 1973 song We're an American Band, where they sing Sweet Sweet Connie doing her act. She had the whole show, and that's a natural fact. Her conquests were extensive, including members of The Who, Led Zeppelin, Van Halen, the Eagles, and Fleetwood Mac, among many others. She claimed she even propositioned future President Bill Clinton when he was governor of Arkansas. In 1995, she published her memoir titled Rock Groupie, The Intimate Adventures of Sweet Connie from Little Rock, detailing her wild experiences on the road. And then, of course, there was Penny Trumbull, the inspiration behind Miss Penny Lane. She was born in 1945 and grew up in Portland with pretty traditional values, balancing her time between helping her parents with rental properties and pursuing her passion for horses. It was her love for music that led her to concerts. Determined to stand out, she formed the Flying Garter Girls with 4 other women, creating a unique approach to interacting with bands. They focused on respect, professionalism, and genuine connection, offering a refreshing alternative to typical groupie behavior. Penny, who became known as Penny Lane, emphasized building authentic relationships with musicians, treating them as guests and providing thoughtful gestures. Soon, the Flying Garter Girls became renowned for their gold satin matchbooks, a symbol of exclusivity and respect among musicians. They prioritized education and career goals, ensuring their involvement in the rock scene was balanced. Penny's approach resonated with musicians, especially with British bands, whom she found charming and humorous. After 3 years, she left the rock scene, pursued higher education, and built a successful career in marketing. Years later, a call from Cameron Crowe brought her past back into focus as he started to discuss his film Almost Famous, inspired by Penny Lane Trumbull's experiences. This is actually quite interesting. A lot of the Almost Famous movie is actually based on Cameron Crowe's own autobiography, and I've always found this really interesting. So he met Penny in the 1970s, and the two had not spoken in over 20 years, I believe, when he invited her to be a guest to his premiere for Almost Famous, which he based sort of loosely on her life and experiences. Miss P was also a big influence behind that. He said that he kind of like combined different stories and different personas to form the Penny Lane character. But Miss Penny Lane Trumbull, of course, with her name and everything, was the main inspiration behind Penny Lane in Almost Famous. Yet for many, what began as an exciting, glamorous lifestyle soon took a darker turn. Drugs, exploitation, and emotional manipulation were rampant as the industry machine continued churning. Few were left unscathed. What had once been a countercultural movement of passion and admiration was now a carefully controlled ecosystem where power and who held it was no longer in question. Chapter 4: The Rise of the Baby Groupies and the Industry of Exploitation. The phenomenon of baby groupies is arguably one of the darkest chapters in the history of rock and roll music, where the exploitation of young girls was often masked by the glamour and rebellion associated with rock star culture. The term baby groupie refers to young girls often as young as 12 or 13 who were sought after by rock stars, sometimes for sexual relationships. These girls were often blinded by the fame of these men, many of whom were fully aware of the girls' ages, but were emboldened by their fame and power. The cases of Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin and David Bowie, among many others, serve as examples of how deeply embedded these exploitative relationships were in rock culture in the 1970s. Here's the thing: 12 or 13-year-olds cannot consent. This might be romanticized by movies like Almost Famous, which I adore. The feeling, the atmosphere, the music, it is fantastic. But it's so important to see this for what it truly was: statutory rape. In the 1970s, the age of consent was 18, while in the UK it was 16, which I think is very low. I know that they raised it to 18 years later, but that wasn't until the 2000s, I believe. The movie Almost Famous does a phenomenal job at showcasing how and why these sexual encounters came to be. Kids, and especially young girls, often have a romantic and naive view of the world, and a lot of young people might think that they want relationships with celebrities. Those fantasies are all part of growing up, and the young girls aren't wrong for having them. But the fully grown adult men who engage in these relationships are. And to some extent, the parents are too. We'll talk about this later. I was a teenager once, dreaming about rock stars. It's fully normal. My parents might have forbade me from going out, but just like other teenage girls, I found my way out. Teenagers, especially young ones, or 12-year-olds who are in fact not even teenagers yet, don't know the trajectory of those things. They don't understand that these men might not be who they want them to. They don't see how wrong and abusive these relationships are. Many of these baby groupies didn't acknowledge the issue until several decades later, after a time away from the rock and roll scene and taking some time to mature. Many of them condemn what they did, but especially what these men did to them. And many are ashamed of being young, naive, and vulnerable. But this shouldn't be their shame. It should be the shame of the men who shamelessly abused their power. These relationships, despite being openly acknowledged at the time, were not seen as predatory or abusive in the same way that they would be today. Instead, they were often romanticized as part of the rock star persona, wild, untamed, and rebellious. This glamorization obscured the predatory nature of these encounters as the line between consensual relationships and exploitation became blurred within the cultural context of the time. The rock and roll ethos, which celebrated sexual freedom and rebellion against societal norms, often overlooked the significant power imbalance between the famous rock stars and the young, impressionable girls. The older, more experienced men were in positions of authority, and the young girls, often enamored with their idols, were vulnerable and easy targets for manipulation. The myth of the rock star and the groupie culture, in which these relationships were framed as adventurous or rebellious, allowed the exploitation of underage girls to go unchecked. The media, the fans, and even the musicians themselves often normalized or ignored the predatory aspect of these relationships, instead focusing on the allure and glamour of fame. There were several baby groupies, but there are two in particular who are a little more famous than the others, because their stories are as wild and bizarre as they are heartbreaking. Lori Maddox, for example, was only 14 when she was involved with Jimmy Page, who was almost 30 at the time. Lori Maddox, or Maddox, depending on which source you look up, who would later go on to call herself Lori Lighting, was born on November 29, 1958, in Los Angeles, California, and she was just entering her teenage years as the American rock and roll scene began to explode. Living in LA, she quickly immersed herself into the world of famous rock stars. At 14, she met Sable Starr, who was already known as the queen of the groupie scene. Sable, who was also underage at the time, introduced Lori to late-night parties on the Sunset Strip. The two girls became regulars at iconic spots like the Rainbow Bar and Grill, Rodney's English Disco, the Continental Hyatt House, which was also known as the Riot House, and the legendary Whiskey A Go-Go. Together, they earned the reputation of baby groupies and became part of the rock and roll crowd. According to an interview Lori gave to Thrillist in 2015, she met David Bowie at E-Club, a nightclub that played host to rock stars and turned a blind eye to drug use and underage girls. It was there on one fateful night that Lori met David Bowie while he was there for his Spiders from Mars tour. Bowie scared Lori at first. She described him to Thrillist as having, quote, hair the color of carrots, no eyebrows, and the whitest skin imaginable. Though he propositioned her, she pretended she was with someone else to avoid going back to his hotel room with him. Quote, I was still a virgin and terrified, Lori recalled. But some months later, David Bowie's bodyguard called Lori and told her that Bowie wanted to invite her out for dinner. Lori took Sable along, thinking that Bowie would sleep with her instead. But once the three of them got back to the hotel room, Bowie invited Lori into his bathroom, where he asked her to bathe him. Then Lori claims she lost her virginity to David Bowie, before later that night having her first threesome with Bowie and Sable Starr. Despite her young age, and despite the fact that she was allegedly woken up by David Bowie's wife pounding on the hotel door, Lori maintains that her sexual encounter with the rock star was a positive one for her. Quote, I was an innocent girl, but the way it happened was so beautiful. I remember him looking like God and having me over a table. Who wouldn't want to lose their virginity to David Bowie? I saw David many times after that for the next 10 years, and it was always great, she explained. After her encounter with Bowie, Laurie fully immersed herself into the rock and roll scene, becoming one of its most well-known baby groupies. When she wasn't hanging out with rock stars, she could easily have been mistaken for any other teenage girl, still living at home with her mother and attending high school. But her world evolved around rock and roll. Not long after her experience with David Bowie, she received a phone call from Jimmy Page, the guitarist and founder of Led Zeppelin. At first, she thought it was a prank, but then a couple weeks later, they crossed paths at the Hyatt house. "Are you Laurie?" Jimmy asked. "I'm Jimmy. I told you I would be with you." Later that evening, when Laurie had made her way over to the Rainbow nightclub, Led Zeppelin's manager approached her. He persuaded her to join him, put her in a limo, and sent her straight back to the Hyatt, directly to Jimmy. "I was being kidnapped," Laurie recalled to Thrillist. "I got taken into a room, and there was Jimmy Page. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and held a cane. It was perfect. He mesmerized me. I fell in love instantly." Laurie and Jimmy were in a relationship for 2 years, though it was often rocky and overshadowed by Laurie's young age. At just 15, she couldn't travel with the band and would instead wait for Jimmy in his hotel rooms. This is a clear sign to me that Jimmy knew how wrong this was, and there were more signs, as we're gonna learn later. She said that she often spent hours upon hours locked away in hotel rooms waiting for Jimmy to be finally done with his show. Despite this, Laurie insists that they were in love and that he was protective of her. He even sought permission from her mother to date her, though Laurie thinks he did so more out of the concern over the potential legal consequences of her age. "My mom liked him," she recalled. "She used to be an agent and was savvy to show business. She knew that I was dating the biggest rock star in the world. She used to say, 'My daughter's like Priscilla Presley.'" Just to be clear here, I put blame on her mom too. There is no way she should have ever allowed this to happen. For me, this adds the layer of child exploitation on her end. Laurie's relationship with Jimmy came to an abrupt end after 2 years. One night after returning from a show, she walked in to find him in bed with Bibi Buell. "I didn't know she would steal my man. I looked at him and said, 'What did you do to me?' I never trusted him again," Laurie recalled. "He was like a god to me and instantly destroyed this whole image I had of him." That moment marked a shift in Laurie's perspective. No longer seeking love, she began to focus on the fun instead. Quote, "After Jimmy, I grew up and got over it. I was still modeling. My life was still rock and roll and rock stars. Of course, there were other guys and amazing situations." Before she turned 18, Laurie would take shots with John Bonham, do drugs with Iggy Pop, have sex in the bathroom with Mick Jagger, and find herself in a bar fight between Paul McCartney and John Lennon. Then she'd go home and be at school at 8 a.m. the next morning. Now in her 60s, with a fashion career in LA, Laurie looks back on her baby groupie years with a more nuanced perspective. Reflecting on her past, she stated, quote, "I don't think underage girls should sleep with guys. I wouldn't want this for anybody's daughter. My perspective is changing as I get older and more cynical." Despite her controversial lifestyle involving sex, drugs, and rock and roll before reaching adulthood, Laurie has no regrets. "I feel like I was very present," she said. "I saw the greatest music ever. I got to hang out with some of the most amazing, most beautiful, most charismatic men in the world. I went to concert in limos with police escorts. Am I going to regret this? No." However, she acknowledged that she was just a child during some of her famous encounters and added, quote, "I feel like it's been degraded somewhere along the way. Groupies in the old days were girlfriends of the band. They were classy and sophisticated." It was Bibi Buell who noted that baby groupies like Laurie Maddox and Sable Starr soon became celebrities in their own right, stating, quote, "Every rock star that came to LA wanted to meet them. It wasn't the other way around." I have mentioned her a couple of times now. Let's take a look at the other famous baby groupie, Sable Starr. Sable Starr, often referred to as the queen of the groupie scene, was a prominent figure in the rock and roll world during the 1970s. Born on September 19, 1957 in Los Angeles, she became infamous for her relationships with some of the biggest rock stars of the time, including David Bowie, Jimmy Page, and Iggy Pop. She started her sexual journey at just 12 years old when she lost her virginity to Randy California, the guitarist of Spirit. By 14, Sable was frequenting Hollywood Sunset Strip nightclubs like the Whiskey A Go-Go, the Rainbow Bar and Grill, and Rodney Bingenheimer's English Disco, where she became one of the first baby groupies. With her petite frame and signature blonde, curly hair, Sable's striking image captivated rock stars. She once remarked, quote, "I always thought of myself as ugly, but after a nose job at 15, she began to see herself as a sex symbol." Sable's rebellious personality and love for trouble were evident in her own words, quote, "I always liked getting into trouble." She also once stated, "I never want to be anything over 14 years old. I'm just going to ignore the years from here on." At just 15, she met Johnny Thunders of the New York Dolls, beginning a truly tumultuous relationship. After running away with him to New York City, Sable's mother reportedly had her kidnapped, leading to a police investigation. Honestly, kudos to her mom for trying to get her out. This is so much more than what Laurie's mom ever did. The relationship was marked by addiction, violence, and Sable's pregnancy, which led her to reject Johnny Thunder's proposal and have an abortion. She later reflected, quote, "He tried to destroy my personality. After I was with him, I just wasn't Sable Starr anymore. He really destroyed the Sable Starr thing." Rumors suggest that she had sexual encounters with nearly every major rock star of the time, including Robert Plant and Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin. Laurie even warned her about Jimmy, saying, quote, "If you touch him, I will shoot you. He's mine." Sable's fame continued to grow as new celebrities flocked to Los Angeles, seeking out the party scene, and she became a fixture in the city's rock and roll lifestyle. Sable was also known for her relationship with Iggy Pop, who later dedicated the song "Look Away" to her. The lyrics recount their affair when she was just 13. "I slept with Sable when she was 13. Her parents were too rich to do anything." I cannot believe that he sang this. This is concerning to me on many levels because it just shows to me that these men weren't only turning a blind eye to the fact that these girls were underage. This was not like, oh, I thought she was 18 and she told me she was 13 and it just happened. This tells me that some of these men were after these girls specifically because of their age. And that just makes it even worse. It makes it gross, it makes it disturbing, and it makes it a deeper crime, at least in my interpretation. Though she primarily had relationships with male rock stars, she also formed some deep and sincere friendships, like with Laurie or fellow groupie Nancy Spungen or Blondie singer Debbie Harry. However, her status as a sex symbol also led to rivalries, notably with Bianca Jagger, who confronted Sable when she showed up at Mick Jagger's store. By the early 1980s, Sable had distanced herself from the groupie scene. She tragically passed away at only 51 years old from a brain tumor. It wasn't until much later, as societal views on consent and power dynamics evolved, that the full extent of the harm caused by these relationships began to be acknowledged. Many of the women who were involved in these situations have since spoken out, detailing the psychological and emotional toll these experiences took on them. For them, the experiences were not glamorous, but rather marked by manipulation, abuse, and a lack of agency. The continued romanticization of the groupie culture and these relationships in rock and roll mythology has contributed to a distortion of history, one in which the very real exploitation of young girls was brushed aside in favor of maintaining the myth of rock and roll freedom and rebellion. This reassessment forces us to confront the darker aspects of an era that, for all its cultural significance, was also one where power dynamics often went unchecked, leading to harm for vulnerable individuals. Chapter 5. Why the 1970s ruined the groupie scene forever. The sheer level of excess in the 1970s ultimately poisoned the groupie culture. What was once a scene of young women forming genuine, albeit imbalanced, connections with musicians became something more exploitative. The normalization of relationships between rock stars and underage girls highlighted the predatory nature of this industry. By the 1980s, the concept of the groupie had drastically shifted in the public eye, from mysterious muses to victims of an unchecked industry. Additionally, as feminism gained traction, the idea of groupies as empowered women began to be critically re-examined. Women who had once been idolized as rock star companions were now viewed as cautionary tales. The press turned on former groupies, slut-shaming them and disregarding their agency while often ignoring the real culprits, the rock stars themselves. Chapter 6. Nancy Spungen's death and the end of groupie culture. But it was Nancy Spungen's tragic death that in many ways shifted the perspective of groupie culture from a romanticized picture of girls traveling with bands, loving music and seeing the world, to a stark reality of exploitation, addiction, and the potential for violence and destruction. Nancy Spungen was born on February 27, 1958 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. From an early age, Nancy struggled with mental health issues, including depression and possibly undiagnosed schizophrenia, which led her to frequently clash with her family. Her rebellious nature and desire to escape the rigid constraints of her upbringing eventually led her to the chaotic world of punk rock. In the mid-1970s, Nancy moved to New York City, where she became deeply immersed in the burgeoning punk rock scene. She started working at the famed rock club Max's Kansas City, where she mingled with musicians and fans, particularly members of the influential band the New York Dolls. It was in this scene that she met Sid Vicious, the bass player of the notorious punk band the Sex Pistols. She started following them around as a groupie before getting together with Sid. Their relationship was immediate and intense, marked by both passionate love and extreme dysfunction. As she later described the connection, quote, "I was just a girl who wanted to be loved, and he was just a boy who didn't know how to love." Their love was quickly consumed by a cocktail of drugs, violence, and self-destructive behavior. Nancy's relationship with Sid Vicious was infamous, with both of them spiraling further into heroin addiction. The Sex Pistols' rise to fame was closely intertwined with their chaotic personal lives, and Nancy's presence in the band's orbit only added to the drama. Nancy was often seen as the ultimate symbol of punk rock's nihilism, with her tragic life representing the darker side of the counterculture. She wasn't just Sid Vicious' lover, she became a part of the Sex Pistols' inner circle, and their reckless behavior garnered constant media attention. Their lifestyle was fueled by drug addiction and wild hedonistic excess. As she herself later said, quote, "It was chaos. The whole thing was just chaos." Nancy's relationship with Sid became increasingly toxic. In October of 1978, after a night of heavy drug use, she was found dead in the bathroom of the Chelsea Hotel in New York City, a place notorious for its connection to rock stars. She had been stabbed in the abdomen. The circumstances of her death were murky, and Sid Vicious was arrested and charged with her murder. Vicious claimed to have no memory of the events surrounding her death, and it was widely believed that he killed her in a heroin-fueled rage, though some speculated that her death may have been an accident or even a suicide. Vicious himself died of a heroin overdose before he could stand a trial for her death. Nancy Spungen's death was a shocking and tragic end to her turbulent life, and it left an indelible mark on the punk scene. It also signified a dark turning point for the groupie culture that had thrived alongside rock and roll excess in the 1960s and 70s. Nancy's death highlighted the dangers of the drug-fueled hedonistic lifestyle that many young women had been caught up in as they followed rock stars, becoming part of the myth of the music scene. As British music journalist Dave Thompson noted, quote, "Her death marked the end of an era in groupie culture. It was the final straw, a tragic warning of just how far the glamorized, destructive lifestyle could go." In the wake of her death, the fascination with groupie culture began to fade, as it became impossible to ignore the real, horrific consequences of that lifestyle. Nancy Spungen in her death became a cautionary tale, and many started to realize that the rock and roll scene, for all its glamour and rebellious spirit, had a much darker side. As punk rock grew, so did the awareness and myth of the groupie. The glamorous, free-spirited woman who was a part of rock history had serious and sometimes deadly consequences. The 1970s left behind a legacy of recklessness and exploitation, and by the time the 1980s arrived, the groupie culture had faded. With changing attitudes towards feminism and accountability, the world was no longer willing to turn a blind eye to the predatory aspects of the music industry. In the 1980s and 90s, groupie culture evolved but remained tied to rock and roll. The glamorized image of 70s groupies faded with the rise of hair metal, punk, and grunge. In the 80s, groupies were associated with bands like Motley Crue, Guns N' Roses, and Bon Jovi. By the 90s, the grunge movement shifted the image of groupies to reflect the raw, disillusioned ethos of the time. Courtney Love, who was both a groupie figure and a rock star, embodied this change. Groupies became less about glamour and more about being part of an alternative culture, with power dynamics and objectification becoming key themes. It is interesting to me how the 1960s and 70s were marked so deeply by groupie culture and how that isn't really a thing anymore. And I think it is because in the 1960s and early 70s, groupies and rock stars, and fans and rock stars in general, were way closer together. Venues were smaller. These rock stars were going out to clubs, meeting fans all the time. While nowadays, most rock stars live quite sheltered, so that close bond between a groupie or a fan and a rock star cannot quite be formed anymore. And that is why I believe that groupie culture could only exist in the 1960s and 70s. It was the perfect time and the perfect place. And with the growing impact of rock stars, it simply collapsed. However, the times of girls traveling with rock stars who refer to themselves as groupies are long gone. The picture painted in Almost Famous of young girls having fun and enjoying music will forever be stuck in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Long before baby groupies and the exploitation took over. Long before underage girls were held in hotel rooms for hours and rock stars abused their roles. Long before Nancy Spungen's death ended the groupie dream. Long before the 1970s, ruined groupie culture forever. Chapter 7. The Reckoning of Rock and Roll's Dark Past. Looking back on the early days of groupie culture, it's impossible not to feel a sense of nostalgia for a time when the wild, carefree spirit of rock and roll seemed pure and untamed. It was a world where the boundary between artist and fan was beautifully blurred, where music wasn't just heard, it was felt, experienced, and lived in every chaotic moment. In those heady days, groupies weren't just anonymous faces in the crowd or passive participants in a celebrity's life. They were the muses, the heartbeats of the backstage chaos, living and breathing the same energy as the music they adored. The rock scene was a stage, yes, but so was the crowd, where every fan had a chance to be part of the story, to contribute to the myth of the music. Groupies were not simply defined by their relationships with musicians, they were icons in their own right. They were women with personalities as bold as the guitars that wailed on stage, with style that spoke volumes about rebellion and freedom. They were spontaneous, fierce, and unafraid to carve out their own place in a world that often minimized them. It was a time when a young woman could feel empowered by her role in the rock scene, where the lines of fame and fandom weren't rigid, and the societal construct of who got to be a star and who didn't was left for the music itself to decide. In those early days, there was a feeling of shared freedom, of women being part of something bigger than themselves. It wasn't just about sex or fame, though that was often part of the experience. It was about being in a space where passion collided, where the energy of the music and the sheer force of youth collided with the reckless abandon of a generation. Women who were part of this world were not seen as passive followers, but active participants in the cultural revolution that rock and roll was ushering in. They were seen, they were heard, and they had a stake in the legacy that was being created, even if only for a fleeting moment. It was a time when groupie culture could be celebrated as an integral part of the music scene, where women were not just groupies, but living pieces of the larger narrative, contributing their own color and life to the canvas of rock and roll. It's the feeling that makes Almost Famous so good, the tale of young girls uniting over their love for music. It's these legendary venues filled with smoke and great music and these girls dancing like there's no tomorrow. But the 1970s forever altered that picture, shifting what had once been a vibrant celebration of youth, freedom, and rebellion into something darker. The rise of baby groupies, young, impressionable girls who were lured into the world of rock and roll stardom, marked a turning point in the narrative of groupie culture. In the early days, the groupie was a symbol of wild independence, a woman who lived for the music and the chaos that came with it. But by the mid-1970s, that image began to fracture. The glamour and freedom were overshadowed by the harsh reality that many young girls, some still just children, were falling victim to exploitation, manipulation, and abuse. The naive innocence of these girls, often no older than 14 or 15, was tragically masked by the allure of fame, drugs, and the intoxicating world of rock stars. Their dreams of a connection with their idols quickly developed into a cycle of manipulation and control. The stars they adored didn't see them as equals or partners in the madness. They saw them as objects of desire, fleeting distraction, and tools for their own gratification. What had once been a world of mutual passion and shared experience became tainted with the toxic combination of power imbalances, substance abuse, and exploitation. In the wake of this shift, the idea of groupies as empowered women was forever distorted. No longer were they the muses of rock and roll, thriving in a space of mutual respect and admiration. Instead, many became trapped in a world where their worth was measured by their proximity to fame, and where their sense of self was often lost in the whirlwind of drugs, manipulation, and unhealthy relationships. In many ways, the groupie dream died alongside Nancy Spungen, an innocent dream ruined by abusive rock stars and drugs. The romanticized image of the carefree, rebellious groupie, someone who was in control of her destiny, who lived in the moment and embraced the spirit of rock and roll, was irrevocably lost. It was replaced by a sobering reality. Groupie culture had become entangled in a web of exploitation, abuse, and tragedy. The dream of freedom and empowerment was eclipsed by a darker, more painful truth. A truth that would haunt the music scene for decades to come. The vibrant, uninhibited world of the early groupies was now gone, forever tainted by the abuse of rock stars, drugs, and broken dreams that followed. And with it, a part of rock and roll soul seemed to die as well. The magic of the early groupie days was forever tainted by the darker, exploitative undercurrent that emerged in the 70s. The golden days of rock and roll, where women could be part of the dream, were gone. The vibrant world of early groupies was forever tainted by the abusive rock stars, drugs, and broken dreams that followed. And with it, a part of rock and roll soul seemed to die as well. So that is it for today's video. The clock just struck 2 a.m. I am not tired, surprisingly. I feel like it'll hit me in a minute, but I really wanted to bring you this video, and I'm so interested in hearing what you think. I personally believe that the history of groupies is so often mistold. When people think about groupies, they think about Almost Famous, and even though Almost Famous does have that layer of exploitation, it still sells that dream of girls adoring music and being with rock stars. Don't get me wrong, I still love Almost Famous. And as said, I think it does a lot of things right with the way that it ends and the way that it does show how heartbreaking these relationships were for women and young girls. But it kind of leaves out the huge imbalancement of power and the exploitation that was actually going on. So let me know what you think and thought of this video and groupies, baby groupies, all of that. There are obviously so many more groupies. One of my personal favorites is the incredible Uschi Obermeier. She was also subject of a Dolls Pod episode before. Her story is also quite heartbreaking, but she was also one of the groupies who was of age, fully able to consent, and definitely had a better experience than Lori and Sable. One thing that kind of stuck with me was how Lori said she did not regret what happened, yet she wouldn't want it for her teenage girls or daughters or someone she knew. That kind of sums it up for me. So many of the quotes and stories that I read about her did say that she was uncomfortable at times. Like, for example, when David Bowie asked her to come with her. But then in the end, it was all fine for her. And it does have that tainted nostalgia look to it. Yet now that she's older, now that she had time away from it, she does see it different. And I think that that's the big part. That is what makes the difference. And that is why Pamela Des Barres, BB Buell, all these beautiful groupies are not the same as these baby groupies were. Because they were at least somewhat fully developed human beings. So yeah, I could go on about this for hours, but my battery's about to die and I need to go to bed. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think. I hope you have a beautiful day. Go out, enjoy the sunshine. Take yourself some time to focus on you and your mental health today, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye, dolls!